of freedom. Slaves, whether one thinks of them as being the African slaves brought to America or in present terms the slave-like conditions of child labor or even sex enslavement, eventually only know enslavement, and their concept of freedom is dulled, and the only understanding that they have is that freedom simply means to be released from bondage. If one were to declare in colonial America, or even in the war between the states, that slavery was an abomination to the moral code of the some might be able to make the argument that it is in fact slavery that permits the masses the enjoyment of inexpensive goods, and to remove slavery as an institution would directly impact nearly all the lives in the country. But more importantly, the nation as a whole, even those who were in favor of abolition of the institution, believed that there was some kind of fundamental difference which would not permit those who were forced into labor to be integrated into society as a whole. Even the one man who eventually removed the yoke from the necks of the slaves did not believe that they could be integrated into society. Well, no friend of the institution of slavery, Lincoln had no desire to free the slaves under any conditions except for two initially. A, give them their own land and separate them from the white population, and B, send them back to Africa. He states, "I will say then that I am not, nor have ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races, that I am not nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." So how would a person who has been enslaved define what freedom means to oneself? While there are few alive today who could definitely answer that question, there is a certain amount of speculation which can be permitted that can at least attempt to understand how the enslaved person might define the concept of freedom. Instinctively, freedom tends to be defined as the ability to do as one pleases within the constructs of the society in which one lives. However, when societal restrictions proclaim that some are freer than others, then one must determine how society defines freedom. Today, society defines freedom as the ability to act in concert with societal restrictions without the fear of reprisals from either those who live in close proximity or the government. Yet a slave would define freedom as nothing more than the ability to make decisions and choices for oneself without fear of reprisals from those who proclaim ownership. The concept of freedom is elusive to those who cannot experience, for whatever reason, what the masses believe to be their God-endowed freedom. There must be an understanding of the fundamental difference between freedom and personal freedoms. Freedom should be defined as the collective rights which best suit the values and morals of a nation that are bestowed upon a populace. Personal freedom can be defined only by each individual with consideration paid to what one's own tolerance may be for the removal of collective freedoms of the populace. To take freedom for granted, a matter of such importance that entire nations will go to war to either protect their way of life or will fight to the death to avoid losing their way of life, is to allow those who would enslave a people to begin to tear at the very fabric of society, rendering it impotent to defend itself, and eventually that society will be in its death throes. Some will say that in this day and age to speak so dramatically about nothing more than a concept is to give too much weight to those few who would attempt to destroy this society. Those individuals should be given a dire warning that it is not a foreign power that is more likely to wish to take away the rights of a nation, but rather those who are in control at the present time. The founders were often concerned with how power was distributed or how power was to be wielded and controlled by those in control. There was at that time, as there is at present, a concerned class of citizenry who worried that the government, if engaged in both the economic affairs and the political affairs of the several states, that a tyrannical form of government would arise. Hamilton, while not succumbing to the perceived threat, stated, for argument's sake, that mere wantonness and lust of domination would be sufficient to beget that disposition in the federal councils to usurp powers with which they are connected. Still, it may be safely affirmed that in the sense of the constituent body of the national representatives, or, in other words, the people of the several states, would control the indulgence of so extravagant an appetite. This declaration was a noble sentiment believed in a kinder and gentler time, but evidence would show that the wantonness and lust of domination prior to the French Revolution was ultimately the cause of the dissolution of the monarchy. Granted, that revolution was started by the people of France and not an elected representative of the people. There is a certain lesson that should be learned from those events. The simple lesson is that if a government becomes so corrupted that it fails its citizenship, then the people have the right to rise up and expel that government by whatever means necessary to regain those rights to which they believe they are entitled. No empire that has ever been created has ever survived, just as no system of government that has been created has ever remained intact. While there is a speculation as to why this holds true, the truth of this argument is borne out in the annals of history. From the Roman Empire to the Egyptian Empire, from the Mongols to the Japanese, as well as the British, Spanish, Germanic, and French empires, all of these exceedingly powerful world empires ended up losing their status in the world, mostly for over-exceeding their resources, but also because the people of those nations rose up from paralyzing poverty and oppression to reclaim what they believed to be their liberties and freedom. There can be no wonder that the system of the United States government will implode as well. A statement made at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 declared, "Government instituted for those who live under it. It ought therefore be so constituted as not to be dangerous to their liberties. The more permanency it has, the worse if it be a bad government. Frequent elections are necessary to preserve the good behavior of rulers." The purpose of the convention was to ensure that those in government could not become tyrants, but ultimately no one took human nature into consideration. Human nature dictates that greed will ultimately overcome any system of government. Greed in the form of the desire for more power or for more material possessions. Greed that will ultimately cause those in power to create laws that eventually diminish the rights of the governed so that those in power can maintain the status quo. Perhaps freedom can better be defined as the right to be free from those who would desire to separate the masses from their perceived definition of what freedom means. This is not an attempt to foment a revolution on a government, but rather to instill in those who would declare themselves to be without desire to neither be involved nor have knowledge of the way that one's government operates to become involved in the political process. Revolution in the United States is generally considered to be against the law. Whatever theoretical merit there may be to the argument that there is a right to rebellion against dictatorial governments is without force where the existing structure of government provides for peaceful and orderly change. No one can conceive that it is not within the power of Congress to prohibit acts intended to overthrow the government by force and violence. That comes from Dennis v. United States, 1951. The question would have to be asked, what if the government in question institutes policies which do not permit change, or the government has become an entity which cannot be altered by peaceful and orderly change? It is not one's neighbor who will be responsible for the removal of rights. It will be, in fact, certain uncontrolled factions within government which have been allowed to remain unfettered. Often the concept of how a government proceeds with removing the rights of its people without the consent of the citizens eludes the populace. This is because many do not equate freedoms with rights, tending to separate the two concepts, believing that rights can be taken away by imprisonment. While some aspect of this thinking has a grain of truth, it must be understood that even a person who is in prison still has many of the rights that those who enjoy personal freedom take for granted. Once those rights are taken away, freedom is automatically stripped away because the concept of freedom is contained within those rights. The individuals who take certain rights of personal freedom for granted should consider the case of Korematsu v. the United States, 1944, in which the Supreme Court determined that in the interest of national security, U.S. citizens of Japanese descent could be imprisoned indefinitely without a trial. The Supreme Court in this instance set aside three of the most important rights that Americans take for granted. The first of the rights abused, the Fourth Amendment, states, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause."